For those of you here who don't know me well or don't know me as an academic, I am a historical and environmental anthropologist, and I study how people politicize impure environments in the long afterlife of American industry. As Maureen mentioned, I've recently begun work in the Northwest United States on separatists who seek to repair body, soul, and soil from the corruptions of the modern world. And it's very interesting research. But the book I'm going to share with you today is based on 14 years of work in a multiracial working class community called Curtis Bay, which is on the southern edge of Baltimore City. Ooh, there we go. All right, so Curtis Bay is a small peninsula roughly 5 hours due south of where we are today, and you can get a feel for its industrial texture in this watercolor map, which is by an artist named Taylor Smith Ham, who's from Baltimore. If you look to the top right corner, you can see why some call this the snaggletooth of Baltimore. Before I was a researcher, again, as Maureen said, excellent introduction, I taught first graders in a building adjacent to this garden here on the bottom, which sits adjacent to this coal pile, which is an icon for the largest coal export terminal along the eastern seaboard. And that terminal juts into the same Patapsco River that now holds the remains of the Key Bridge, which you might remember collapsed into the water this past March. The container ship that hit the bridge, which is of course pictured here, was traveling global trade routes that connect this site to places all around the world. And it turns out that the schoolhouse is connected to a million elsewheres too. Constructed during the 1940s for the kids of wartime workers who built ships and manufactured weapons here. And again, it's where I worked my first job out of college. 6-year-olds in Curtis Bay are like 6-year-olds anywhere else, which is to say they're sticky and ridiculous. They like Pokemon and unicorns. They want to grow up to be butterflies, and trying to wrangle 25 of them at once is enough to send a person off a cliff. Not me, of course, I stayed completely sane. So this was my first class in 2010, looking about as composed as we ever did. Later that day, Jemiah told me that 4 minus 3 is 1, and also that I would get eaten by a wolf. Patrick chipped a tooth trying to do the sprinkler dance move during show and tell. Charlie caught his vomit in his hands so as to keep his favorite reading carpet clean, which honestly I really appreciated. Marcus emptied out the contents of his desk and staged a sit-in because he didn't want to go to gym. And no one ever banned him from our school. It's crazy. If you have been to my office, and I know a few of you have, and seen the little note on my chalkboard, this note, it's from Marissa, and it says, with so much shade, why did you pick this job? Right? These wild, goofy, brilliant, completely normal 6-year-olds also surprised me by skipping recess because they found that air pollution made it hard to breathe, which made it hard to run. Before I met these kids, I hadn't heard of this peninsula, but one of the more chilling parts of research was learning that I'd been there. The hospital waste from my birth near Washington, D.C., traveled to South Baltimore for burning in the nation's largest medical waste incinerator, which is represented by the smokestacks at the bottom. So my work takes up these connections as part of a much longer story about the role this site has played in the governance of future danger for the past 2 centuries, and for the benefit of folks like you and me who are chemically complicit in what happens here. That story moves from the region's early life as a quarantine zone under precautionary public health regimes, through years provisioning the US military for both real and speculative warfare, and culminating in plans to build a 4,000-ton per day capacity trash incinerator there, billed as a climate solution, big air quotes, and euphemistically called the Fairfield Renewable Energy Project. So very broadly, I consider how efforts by city, state, nation, and corporation to master the future have produced an ambiguously toxic atmosphere that has shaved years off local lives. And I do that through archival work spanning the entire life of Baltimore City. On the ground, I explore how people I've come to care for over 14 years and who breathe in these histories relate to the future after Fordist expectations fall apart. You might know Fordism as one name for that distinctly American factory form that coupled the production of standardized goods with the production of a very specific kind of social order. And here I'll just briefly add that Henry Ford was a raging white supremacist who also manufactured whiteness for a largely migrant workforce, And we'll return to those ideas in a little bit. But Fordism also named an organization of anticipation, or a way of relating to the future, based on the dream of progress toward the good life. And today, that dream doesn't seem to hold much water. So my book, Futures After Progress, hews close to people living in this aftermath: factory workers, local elders, student activists, air quality regulators, labor leaders, engineers, plant managers, 6-year-olds, and more. And if you want to talk about the promises and challenges of doing such wide-ranging work, we can definitely go there during Q&A. In brief, I write about their everyday attempts to build a future in a place presumed to have no future, and where state and corporate efforts to manage the uncertain future have historically done extraordinary harm. I do this knowing full well it contradicts the received wisdom that the American Rust Belt is an emblem of the past. And it runs counter to a major current in critical theory, which holds that because progress failed, we should abandon the illusion of a future, which makes for a fierce polemic, but doesn't actually help you understand how people live in places like South Baltimore. So when I say future, I mean a sense of what is possible, worth hoping for, worth working toward. I mean the future as a political object, which means that abandoning it has enormous stakes. That includes abandoning it to the sort of career speculators tasked with managing the future as a resource, who I study in the book and who have done a number here. What they have not done is exhaust locals out of politics or evacuate the future as a field of ordinary aspiration. So while the book tracks 200 years of violence waged in the name of mastering the world to come, it also considers the modes of speculative imagination taking hold here that shape local sense of reasonable desire. And along the way, it tries to give us more to work with when we talk about the future than the apocalyptic and utopic visions that tend to dominate this tense in theory. I think this matters, as most people live between these two extremes. It also matters at a moment marked by foreboding visions of the national future, 6 days out from the election, to say nothing of the despair so many of us feel in the face of climate change. So if all of that sounds cerebral, fair, but in Curtis Bay, it's really quite concrete. This place teems with the remains of former futures, which announce themselves on landscapes and embodies. Drive around and you'll see murals like this that depict an inaccessible before slapped on walls that half conceal old factories, which used to support a third of Baltimore's workforce. Stay, and you'll take in the thick black dust that covers cars and clotheslines, stoops and slides, kids' bicycles, that touches everything and comes from everywhere, and that once signaled a complex prosperity. It's made of fumes from tanker trucks that fill up at the region's oil terminals, soot from coal piles that climb high above the park, emissions from that medical waste incinerator I mentioned earlier, which burns biohazard bags from beyond both state and national borders, and clouds from chemical plants whose managers stave off inquiring minds with platitudes like, "Chloe, everything we make is dust." It's hard to live with these material remainders and watch them cut lives short for friends and neighbors, which they do. The sticky, silly kiddos from my class lose parents, aunts, uncles, neighbors, grandparents, and friends at higher rates than almost anywhere in Maryland. And the Baltimore City Health Department reports that 50%, right, half of deaths here are avoidable. It's harder still to know these deaths have been accepted as the cost of doing business, which they have. And the book traces 200 years of governing decisions behind this grim reality. To be more precise, the book unfolds in two main parts, and the first features this cautionary tale, showing how successive uses of this place to enable futures elsewhere gradually produced bad air on this peninsula. But not only that. Through speculative modes of governance that slowly severed air as lived from air as modeled in a lab, right, that slowly severed the possible from the actual. They also privileged official ways of knowing air that class embodied knowledge as uncertainty. What this means in the most concrete sense is that locals live in a deliberately polluted place and are hamstrung in their efforts to make claims about this fact. They live with a material and evidentiary haze. This haze is the setting for the ethnographic chapters that largely animate part 2, which for non-anthros in the room just means that the chapters storytell through sustained engagements with real people. There, I explore local efforts to organize against state-sanctioned harm in the absence of state-sanctioned knowledge, and because no one lives a life of pure abjection, I follow people's everyday attempts to build a future from within the existential mess that capital F futurists have made. To me, again, that is the banner aspiration of this book, and part of what it means to write responsibly about a place that some 10,000 folks call home. Against this history of technocratic hubris, within a growing anthropology of the future very much concerned with expert subjects, and in a political present that figures Rust Belt sites like this as backward. In response to all of that, the book reclaims the future as a field of common practice in the still industrial United States. It is visceral and not abstract. It shapes fears, hopes, resentments, and regrets. It animates political projects, including those in intense competition. And that's why this meta story of the book feels a little weird to me, because at core, Futures After Progress is a near-sighted account of how speculative practice has shaped a tiny place full of people I adore, and how it might shape all of us who live within its orbit. It's also a really speculative text itself, and I can say more about that later too. But for now, if it's cool, I'd like to share some more intimate accounts drawn from its pages. For time, especially because it is again such a gorgeous day, I'm going to bracket part 1 of the book, specifically chapter 1, which shows how 200 years of speculative governance gradually produced a toxic atmosphere and delegitimized embodied ways of knowing air, and chapter 2, which follows organizing around these themes during the late Cold War. I'm going to bracket both of those and instead introduce you to 3 women I know well, whose hopes are quite distinct and whose ties to this place span 3 generations. I'm going to start as the book begins with Angel. Angel brushed dust from her stoop with a few napkins from the diner and invited me to sit, apologizing for the mess. We opened our styrofoam boxes and ate while her kids played. Marissa, Angel's oldest, hung back while the 3 boys ran ahead, racing after lights fixed on the coal pier, which you can see here. It was an impossible target, but they seemed to take some pleasure in the chase. Angel sighed. She kicked a can and popped a French fry in her mouth. When we were teenagers, we used to sit here all the time and talk about how Donald Trump was supposed to take over our neighborhood. I must have looked a little wary because she nodded as she continued. It was some kind of rumor. He was supposed to tear down all the factories and build up condos on the water. So for many years, people have said that he's going to build up Curtis Bay, and we were going to become Curtis on the Bay. I think I laughed, like you. It was early 2016 when Trump was in the business of taking over land, not civic institutions, but still the thought of gilded condos on this coast felt out of place. Besides the coal piles that blocked our view of the water and coated every surface with their ominous debris, Angel and I sat amid the quiet fallout of a few American projects. A landfill nearing capacity, several hazardous dumps, some scrapyards, a defunct military depot, a graveyard for old ships, a medical waste incinerator. Even the graveyard lacked the kind of past that might attract a spectacle. It was the silent resting place for boats that, and this is a newspaper article quote, for boats that lived a life of anonymous toil until they sputtered to their end right here and stayed. So I snickered at the image of this peculiar revival bankrolled by this unlikely hero. I didn't realize then that Angel's story wasn't about Trump. It was about the mess of want and mourning weighing down the dream of what we were going to become for the we who used to sit here all the time. It wasn't about a speculator so much as it was the modest visioning of kids raised at the end of a world and trying hard to build up futures in its wake. Because I missed the point, I followed up on the wrong story. A few months after my stoop-side meal with Angel and before Trump's electoral win, I read about a kindred dream in Gary, Indiana. It was 1993, reporters set the scene, and the New York mogul was promising to make the wasteland great. What followed was, we now know, fairly patterned. a big pitch, a big deal, a letdown, a lawsuit. Today, Gary has 2 gaudy gaming boats and 3 decades of hard feelings to show for the whole thing, and reporters call it a cautionary tale. The caution: don't trust a charlatan, but also check your sense of reasonable desire if you come from a place like Gary, Indiana, because the future is a losing bet in these United States. I could write a version of that story that lets a reader sit in the space of knowing better, snickering at the prospect of a Baltimore revived. All the makings for that tale exist in Curtis Bay. I could enroll in a project of devaluing futurity so much that one might sell it off for pennies to a grifter who says that things cannot get any worse. And Angel must have worried that I might because she intervened. I doubt that Donald Trump is going to save the day. But you never know. I wouldn't mind if someone came and cleaned up Curtis Bay. With that, Angel swept away what little dust she could and apologized again for its relentlessness. I had been to Angel's home before, enough to know the mess was not her fault. Her living room was immaculate, a feat for a single mother with 4 kids, but the front porch was a losing battle. It wasn't usually where she hosted me, but the boys were itching to get out and it was getting late and Angel wanted to keep watch. I met Angel's kids before she and I crossed paths. In 2010, 6-year-old Marissa was a student in my class, the one who left that note. She's 20 now, which I find absolutely bonkers. But at the time, she was a tiny girl with tawny skin and deep brown eyes, quiet, clever, and awfully tidy for a first grader. Every afternoon, she would straighten the pencils on each desk and adjust the pint-sized chairs so they aligned with the linoleum tile. Lots of kids wanted to help prepare the room, but she was the one I trusted. I soon learned that Marissa was the oldest of 4 children, practiced in keeping order, and as I got to know her family, I came to see these same traits in her mother. Not the quiet part, but definitely the attachment to containment. With no hair out of place and no patience for foolishness, Angel worked to keep the mess in check. But the dust accrued on her front stoop was a cruel reminder that containment is a futile gesture in South Baltimore. I find it both disturbing and intriguing that while working at the school, I gave very little thought to air pollution. This, even though my students would complain about the dust. I drove from home to school each day along a road dotted with gas stations and pop shops, which is a local word for corner stores. Always that same road, right? Ever a creature of routine. But had I diverted slightly, I might have understood this haze was no coincidence. I might have noticed that the neighborhood housed dozens of smokestacks or been troubled by coal mountains towering above the park. I might have appreciated that the thickness of the air in Curtis Bay made it easier for me to breathe downtown, or that my garbage traveled there on diesel trucks each week. That I didn't speaks volumes about my position, my detachment, and the circumstances that enabled both. So I could pass through with relative ease, but Marissa embodied industrialism. If I'm being honest, my tense relationship with Curtis Bay is older than Marissa. So I grew up 30 miles in the opposite direction on the northeast edge of Washington, D.C. And this is a picture of me and my little sister on my first day of kindergarten, which I share because it's very cute, and also because in this picture I would be about a year younger than Marissa was when she was in my class. Anyways, I know my family passed this part of town on the highway when we drove to Baltimore to visit relatives. We use fertilizer produced in Curtis Bay to green our lawn. I already told you that the hospital waste from my birth and my sisters and my daughters travel to this area for burning, and maybe yours too, since hospitals as far away as Canada truck their refuse to South Baltimore. That waste, fleshy matter, polyvinyl chloride plastics, and the like, it doesn't simply disappear. When exposed to heat, it produces potent compounds like dioxin. Dioxin is an endocrine disruptor known to reduce fertility, obstruct embryo development, and even cause miscarriages. Angel had one agonizing birth, and it's hard to say if dioxin is to blame. It's hard to say if my birth or my sisters or my daughters circumscribed another's. So the book tracks these chemical complicities, to remind readers that any book about this place also implicates a million elsewheres, also implicates the author and the audience. But Angel doesn't blame me for the dust, doesn't resent me for being in the structural position of someone whose life is yoked to death in Curtis Bay. And besides, old-timers will tell you that the dust is nothing like it used to be. Factories have been closing for years by the time I began work there, decades actually, and air quality improvements soon followed. I don't want to overstate these improvements. In 2007 and 2008, Curtis Bay ranked first in the entire country for air pollutants released from stationary sources like smokestacks, clocking in at more than 20 million pounds per year. That this counts as an improvement is stunning, but I will leave it. I heard discomforting stories from residents who came of age here during World War II. They remember having to pause during sports and wait for clouds to pass. Weird clouds, clouds that moved unnaturally, clouds that came in many colors. People told me there was something in the air that burned holes in freshly laundered clothes hung out to dry, and some could only play outside when the wind was blowing east toward the water. But old-timers rarely lingered on these images, and I suspect that few shared them to worry me. More often, they were background to sentimental tales about how much sweeter life here was before the late industrial. There was an expectation then that enduring tough times in the present would eventually net you a good life. We often gloss this myth as the American dream, but it's better located in a sacrificial social contract that only ever promised its pursuit. Take on harm today so you can strive toward tomorrow. So when the whole thing came tumbling down, people lost more than factory employment. They lost a particular relationship with the future, and they also lost the steadiness it brought. Angel, whose formative years tracked with this regional falling from grace, said she grew up in a lost generation. Born in the early 1980s, she remembers busy workers, crowded taverns, the neighborhood's distinctive smell, and the good life that the factories promised. But she also watched that promise atrophy. She watched her mother's generation atrophy with it through suicide, heroin, and alcohol. She ran away from home and learned to hustle for her kids, cutting hair and pouring drinks and sweeping floors, piecing together 4 young lives through a million low-wage jobs. It's hard to organize one's world in anticipation of a future that seems increasingly untenable and to live amid its uneasy remains, so much that one might abandon the illusion of a future. Had she? I asked. She gestured toward her boys roughhousing in the coal pier's yellow light. I guess the future changes, Angel shrugged. Now, if Angel's shrug made the attrition of old futures seem casual, it was because Angel liked to keep the mess in check. For many, though, the end of factory work was a disorienting loss. It not only meant the becoming visible of environmental harms previously brushed off as the cost of doing business, it also meant the desecration of old rhythms. Steady wages, mortgaged homeownership, robust unionism, the welfare state, and the nuclear family formed, to name a few. These modes of predictable, measured incrementalism made it possible for Fordist subjects to approach the future with a sense of reasonable confidence. It's true, this confidence required a measure of forgetting, as the dust accrued in Curtis Bay suggests. It also turned on racialized exclusions, though these were often disavowed through bootstrap myths, like the myth that whites' upward mobility depended on hard work alone and not on subjugated Black labor. In fact, industrial slavery was common in the pre-emancipation city, and for generations after, elites exploited interracial tensions to blunt worker solidarity and keep Black folks from the most desirable factory jobs. Or the myth that the mortgage structured opportunity rather than predation. Housing discrimination persistently shunted poor Black residents into more precarious straits than their white neighbors, and mortgage debts locked both groups into devastating binds as their houses grew increasingly engulfed. But for those Fordism favored, the happy promise was that one could look ahead with something sturdier than hope, and few took it lightly when those expectations crumbled. Take Betty, a white woman and Angel's 60-something-year-old aunt, who here stands in for a group of elders I foreground in chapter 3. I also met Betty during my teaching years, and she took a liking to me, the way one takes a liking to a kitten that has lost its precious way. She was sure I needed guidance and protection as a harmless-looking thing, slight, white, and feminine, that had landed in a rough and tumble part of Baltimore. Proudly claiming both roles for herself, Betty toured me around to meet old heads who could educate me about Curtis Bay while ensuring I avoided shady areas. And at times, my so-called harmlessness made me an alibi for insolence that called it self-defense, like when Betty vowed to bitch slap any thugs who bothered me. I told her no and tried to laugh the offer off. During our frequent drives together, Betty swung between desperate efforts to revive the future that had marked her youth. When Curtis Bay was nice, you would have liked it. And making spiteful accusations about its death. Among the culprits that she rattled off to me were drugs, taxes, the blacks, the Democrats, and those corner stores that sell iPhones for food stamp cards. Many of these charges came from right-wing news and meme accounts on Facebook, two platforms that center cultural battles as a stand-in for a class critique that is never waged, and offer frameworks through which Betty understood the shifts she lived. Shifts like staggering wage reductions for former factory workers, the loss of health care and retirement for tens of thousands, a dip in U.S. life expectancy for the first time in more than 60 years, and a whole host of intangible but still important shifts. I don't mean to suggest that Betty's bigotry emerged whole cloth from right-wing media, because it didn't, so much as pundits channeled age-old frames to sell a sense of whiteness under siege that appealed to listeners like her at this historic juncture. Even more on this peninsula, where progress toward whiteness for white ethnic migrant workers was wrapped up with progress toward inclusion and an aspiring middle class, and this is something that I focused quite a bit on in the early chapters. Both of these, now profoundly insecure, so much that Betty, riled up after her shows, took it upon herself to return the neighborhood to equilibrium, like the time she ran around hassling shopkeepers for donations so the seniors club could hire an oldies band for Christmas. I told one of them, look, give me $5 for my club or we're gonna have a fucking problem. Betty had a temper. She'd been through it in the 1990s, which is a euphemism for addiction, and came out rearing to defend what she had left. That included the dignity that came from figuring herself as a victim whose future had been stolen by bad actors, rather than a patsy who had sacrificed for nothing. So the last thing Betty was going to do was call the future an illusion, but she also knew it wasn't going to be a steady climb from good to great. She'd lost her health to COPD, her husband to cancer, her kids had moved away, and besides, there goes the neighborhood. If there was going to be a future, it wasn't going to look like progress. So Betty traded tales like Curtis on the Bay that had revanchist undertones and some that needed no interpretation. During my longest fieldwork stint, which began in the wake of the 2015 Baltimore uprising and wrapped up on the eve of the 2016 presidential election, such tales became increasingly common. The uprising, of course, was a response to the death of Freddie Gray, a young black man after a rough ride with the Baltimore police. It brought thousands to the streets to affirm that Black Lives Matter. And voting for Trump was Betty's ornery response. Revanchist politics and revivalist calls to make the country great again, these weren't linear trajectories. They sought return to that ambiguous before time when the future didn't yet seem too far gone. They also voiced a felt sense of anachronism, of being out of step with once affirming expectations. And that feeling was made worse by a built environment that kept former futures in plain sight, like street-side murals that still flaunted scenes of what we were going to become. The B&O Railroad, the Liberty Fleet, the Coast Guard Yard, an expansive open bay, a school, a church, a party at the beach, a picnic at the park. Betty took me by these murals all the time to reminisce and also to complain that even portraits of this place had gone to shit. The paint was chipped and there were gaps in the cinder block walls where you could glimpse the shuttered factories behind them. It's a real shame, she'd say, but rumor has it they'll be torn down soon to build the next Trump Tower. It did not happen. They were raised to make room for Amazon. So Betty's comments, caustic as they were, suggest that people could lose their taste for progress without abandoning the future. More, for those who felt their best days were behind them, progress and the future were at odds. Imagine then the surging hope that one could actually gain ground back. Imagine the trajectories one might miss by letting progress stand in for the future as a whole, and imagine trying to understand the political present while insisting on these two terms' correspondence. For one, it would mean misconstruing the direction and the force behind the movements that drew Betty, for whom progress was at best a bygone aspiration. But also, as many others caution, progress narratives sound so loudly even to their critics that it can be hard to notice other rhythms, those variable futures popping in and out of possibility precisely where futurity would seem to be exhausted. Walk the full length of those peeling murals, past Coal Mountains and a place called Final Notice, and round the bend at Fred and Margie's diner, decked out with a disco ball. A few blocks more, and you'll find yourself outside a school that has been there for generations. Arrive around mid-afternoon, and you will wade through squealing teenagers to make it down the hall. Things begin to settle near the library, where most Wednesdays during fieldwork I'd cozy into quiet, until students raced in, traded snacks, and launched conversations that kept us buzzing well after nightfall. For all the time that we spent mapping signs of progress lost, chipped paint, pocked streets, Betty never took me here, where other futures were beginning to cohere. But the same years that saw her hopes grow increasingly regressive also saw a multiracial group of high school kids stake out this little space, where I ground chapters 4 and 5, and where we nurtured other notions of the possible. What's the word, Destiny, a recent graduate, swept her loose afro aside and let her hand fall on her furrowed brow. Like, I want to say the system, but that feels too big. Charles, a Black senior, offered policies. She started to nod, then took it back. Too small. We need, she closed her eyes to think, because we're not just talking about government. Right. Charles thumbed his chin while Destiny searched beneath her eyelids. The two friends huddled there, pursuing words to frame the day's activity. Meanwhile, the rest of us caught up. Elijah, a charismatic Black 15-year-old, told a tale from English class that demanded a whole-body performance. Ben, a blonde athlete, played along. Chris played a song. Then Destiny called us to attention. Today, we're going to draw a problem tree. Destiny turned to sketch an outline on the board, a too-fat trunk with skinny roots and finger-licking branches that brought Elijah laughing to the floor. Ben and Charles tried to shush him, but before long they were laughing too, and we were getting side eyes from across the library. Shh, Destiny chided, just long enough to introduce the problem. We were going to talk about pollution, starting with the ways it manifests in daily life, the leaves. Then we'd work backward to the policies, practices, and habits that prop it up, the branches, and further still to the value systems at their roots. You don't see the roots when you look at a tree, but there they are, Destiny pointed, reminders that the world is built on values we can change. That's deep, someone quipped. Charles snorted at the pun, and the whole group lost its bearings yet again, and I let myself forget that Betty found these students threatening. We proceeded in joyful fits and starts until Destiny wrangled us into a working rhythm. At her prompt, we filled leaves with experiential evidence. Coal piers, smokestacks, diesel trucks. We don't know what's in the air. People act like they don't care. Asthma, cancer, coughing, heart disease. Beneath them, branches name forces like industrial zoning, narrow regulations, powerful corporations, insufficient healthcare, and a lack of local pushback. Beneath them, roots spoke of systems designed for profit over human rights, of a willingness to sacrifice some places for the greater good, of the sense that Curtis Bay has always been a dumping ground, and of deep divisions among locals that strained solidarity. By the time the school custodian came to shoo us out, we had sketched the contours of a shared analysis. Next time, destiny would guide us as we move from that analysis to the more speculative task of figuring the world we one day hope to see. Articulating different values, imagining practices that could give those values form, and picturing how those changes might be lived from day to day. To do this well required work. If you want to build a future that breaks from the past, the theory went, then you had better know your history. So students didn't spontaneously produce this deep analysis. There were years of collective labor behind the problem tree. For 3 years before I joined them, providing research support and participating broadly in their organizing efforts, the group had been talking stoop-side with their neighbors and grappling with local legacies of dispossession. Those years were full of study and debate, of play, of piecing together a past that they were not taught, but whose debris was ambient. They could sense it in the land, in the air, and in their neighbors' mix of animus and apathy. They could sense it in their parents, who rarely reminisced about the local past, and in their own shortage of local prospects. Born and raised in a Curtis Bay that differed vastly from the one of Betty's childhood, most students scraped by in a drearily post-Fordist place and were urged to grow up and out if they wanted to realize their full potential. I know kids as young as 6 who got this message from their families. So yes, this group's work could be distressing, but the hope was that digging up this past might help them seed a different vision. At least they sought to fight depictions of Curtis Bay that would reduce it to pathology. Destiny, for one, was well aware of the fault lines Betty's bigotry arranged and had watched firsthand as damaged frameworks wore away at neighbors who came to see their hometown as a wasteland. That was on the tree in black and white, where people act like they don't care found roots in the dumping ground mentality. The aims of students' work, as I came to understand them over many afternoons, were to rechannel local resentment about being Baltimore's dumping ground so that it might inspire action and stretch into the realm of what could be. The problem tree was one of many exercises that helped them do this work of staying open to the world and refusing to be depleted. It's very hard to sustain the provocation at the heart of this work and refuse to be exhausted out of politics. It takes a lot of nerve to stay open in the face of so much violence. Would Destiny and her friends have been better off abandoning the future? I hesitate to say so, though I concede that hope is often disappointed. But disappointment must be risked when building better worlds than this one is a matter of survival. Even a cursory look at the books that Destiny carried in her bag, books about making life after the end of the world by the likes of Octavia Butler, little signs that speculative thought is alive and well in Curtis Bay, suggest she might agree with this insistence. Chasing neither progress nor its hostile overthrow, and wanting something greater than endurance, Destiny admired stories that paired an unflinching acknowledgement of harm done with a will to build worlds otherwise. Neither Betty nor Destiny could be accused of relinquishing the future, though they surely had divergent aspirations. What emerges when one reads their aspirations side by side? 2 pieces of the fractured present from which I wrote those words, not easily resolved, and there are others still that animate the book's 5 body chapters, each angling to set the terms of the unsettled world to come and insisting this was no end of the line. These starkly different futures might have stayed apart but for another proposition. I want to close us out here. When I began what would become years of ethnographic work in Curtis Bay, Betty, Destiny, and their neighbors were debating the vices and virtues of the Fairfield Renewable Energy Project. If built again, it would have been the largest trash incinerator in the nation, burning 4,000 tons of waste every day to generate allegedly clean power in Maryland's most polluted neighborhood. Though touted as a climate solution, it also would have released thousands of pounds of lead, mercury, fine particulates, and carbon dioxide. proposed in 2009 and slated for construction on a 90-acre plot, which had once been used for quarantine, before it was used to craft munitions, before it was used to manufacture pesticides. The Fairfield project came to stand for competing visions of the local future, as large-scale infrastructure often does. Some, led by Destiny and her classmates, protested it would solidify their neighborhood's position as a dumping ground. Others, like Betty, hoped it might revive them from an economic slump. For a time, the proposal generated stark debates about what residents could reasonably desire from within the haze kicked up by an aging industrial order, and this is the concrete conflict around which much of the book spins. They were debates about the future of this place, but they also made South Baltimore the stage for planetary dramas about the paths the rest of us might take in the face of ecological apocalypse. This very bold claim seems a little bit less so when you recall South Baltimore has long been bound to futures elsewhere, often in the most material of ways. And we could talk about what this fact has meant for the book's methods if you like. But for now, if you want to know whether this place turns out to be a cautionary tale or the spark of something altogether different, then you will have to do the reading. Thanks.
Time for questions. I'm going to bring the microphone around just so that our Zoom folks can hear questions that folks have.
Hi, Matt.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Chloe. It was a beautiful talk, and I know you say explicitly in the book that this is not a book about Trump, but Jesus, if it's not
you read
lurking.
My book? That's so nice. Go ahead.
I've begun it. I feel like I'm in class again. Yeah. So but the specter of the moment certainly looms over it. My question is not actually going to be about that, though. I was really struck by your kind of honesty and the observation that you didn't notice the air, right? Or that wasn't present, right, when you were there. And it got me, I wanted to ask, like, thinking, so, this is when you're teaching there. Could you tell us a little bit more about the kind of development of the project? So it's at some point, you're not very far away, you go to graduate school and you come back maybe armed with a new set of theoretical tools and approach. But are there still ways in which the project you may have had in mind as a graduate student shifted by the end of the project? So I'm kind of asking for like the meta narrative of how the project came to be, I guess in a condensed way.
Yeah, so I was talking to a student last week who is having like what feels like a last minute change of heart about what their dissertation is, which I think is actually not uncommon. And I was a student like that. So I went to graduate school immediately out of the teaching job, and I wasn't interested in environmental issues at all. I was interested in education. And I wanted to do ethnographic work on this moment, the twilight of No Child Left Behind, which predates a lot of folks in this room, but this was like a very intense, like testing, focus, accountability, there were a lot of accountability measures for making sure that schools were on track that had really material consequences. And I wanted to understand how this national policy was creating tensions at the level of a community school, and specifically the school where I taught. I really wanted to go to grad school because I had no time to think during teaching, and there was a lot that happened. And so I went back to school to slow down and reflect. I started that project and started to have conversations with local elders in the process of kind of getting that off the ground. So for grad students in the room, my first few graduate school summers. And I started for the first time to get a sense of local history. I also started to hear elders draw comparisons between some of the intensely quantifiable ways of knowing student capacity that characterized this policy with with government reports that they had seen circling through the neighborhood that tried to know this place in a particular way, but had very little to do with history and place, as both were lived. So I started getting curious, but like many students, I I applied to school with a particular vision. I was going to see that through. I wrote all my grants. I bought all my books for qualifying exams. And on my birthday in 2014, I finally let myself change the project because I just had felt a pull. It was totally unprepared. There were no environmental anthropologists in my program at all. Which is kind of appropriate because I think I'm secretly a political anthropologist who thinks with the medium of environment. So I tried to figure it out. I made a lot of mistakes, but I don't know. That's one version of the story. I actually feel like I have been learning new things about this project all along. So one of the most influential sets of inquiry that I went down was during the process of revising the book. After I had drafted the book, not the dissertation, we're several years into this job at Cornell, learning a little bit more about my family's ties to this place over generations, right? So if during graduate school, one of the things that was interesting to me and curious to me was why it had been so easy to not know about pollution in this place and what dissociative habits locals themselves had honed to not pay attention all the time to pollution in this place. I was still discovering things that I didn't know until a year and a half ago when I found this memoir of my great-great-great-grandmother about growing up in Baltimore. So yeah, you just never know a place, really. It's been super fun to get to spend so much time with it.
Thank you.
Hi, Chloe. This was so great. Great to see the book come to life. I took down every note that you said about the word future because I think you talk about it in such an interesting way. And as I'm sure you know, a lot of our social science counterparts are sort of in the business of predicting the future, often in some sort of doomsday ways. And so I'd love to hear more about your methods of what does it mean to study future time as an ethnographer? How do you study the future in the ordinary? I think you talked about it a lot, but yeah, maybe what is your pitch for sort of the anthropology of the future and how people who are interested in thinking about a different type of time can go about figuring out what that is?
I love that question. I feel like I have a few different directions I want to go, and let me see if I can bring them all together. I'll start at the end. I have two pitches, I think just two, maybe more. We'll see, for folks who are interested in the anthropology of the future, which feels like a weird sub-field, but it seems to be gaining some ground. So one, and I mentioned this a little bit at the beginning, I actually think formal futurists, experts who do speculative work for industry, government, the Rand Corporation, are some of the least interesting people to look at when it comes to trying to grapple with what it means to live in anticipation and try and build a world that is somewhat different from the one in which you live. So that's one. Let's not only pay attention to experts, although I do in the book, and I'll hopefully remember to return to that in a minute. Another is there's folks in the room who are in anthro might know this, but folks who don't, there's been this turn in the last X number of years to sort of romanticizing speculative practice within the discipline as if this is a necessarily liberatory path. And I think that we should all just be a little bit more humble about making claims like that. One of the things that Curtis Bay teaches, even as it teaches that there are ways to privilege the possible over the actual that help you build a better world, is that there's nothing inherently liberatory about speculation. It's actually a source of incredible violence here over the course of 200 years. And so let's not get too precious, I guess, about the future as a space of promise and speculation as a method for instilling that in our own practice as ethnographers. So those are some of my pitches to the anthropology of the future. Your other question is about like, how do you study the future? Okay, so half the book does look at formal futurists. I think about a 200-year process through which, like, the gradual honing of speculative tools for the purpose of governing the city, the state, the nation, and the corporation, how that was also a process of gradually losing history and place from the work of governance. And there are lots of ways to track that in the archive and also in the archive's absences as place and past fall away. And so you can find the future in some obvious stuff like population level statistics that predict where epidemics are likely to spring up. In the military archives, when people imagine, you know, if there's an attack here, this is how many trucks we're going to need to mobilize supplies, and this is how many troops are going to need to move along. And in things like toxic risk assessment, which I spend a lot of time in the book, which is a practice of governing hypothetical air in conjectural blank space and not air as it is lived. And so you can look there, and you can also think about the gaps between the way the future appears in the archive and the way that people remember their lives lived in those historic moments. You can also study the future in classrooms. So like the scene that I ended on is of course from this youth-led campaign to stop the construction of the incinerator, which was really a campaign to sort of change the fate of Curtis Bay through this targeted fight. And part of a very explicit political education project through which students were enrolled in movement work with roots in the Poor People's Campaign. And the movement theory that animates that campaign is prefigurative politics. So it's a really big word, but it actually just means exactly what it says. It's about prefiguring the future in the present and organizing your movement work as if the world that you are trying to build is the world that you are inhabiting. And so you can see the future in the playfulness, the intense collaboration, and the use of arts to make speculative practice like something that you can touch and feel. It's a really long answer, but stop romanticizing speculation. It's just a tool. Like, it can do good things and bad things, actually. Pay attention to experts, but not only. And when you do that, the future starts to look a lot more multiple.
A question online. I'm still sitting with the vignettes you shared about childbirth, labored breathing, and I want to know, how do you see bodies of the children, parents you were talking to over these years changing with the environment? I'm asking this question in the context of Alex Blanchet's Porkopolis.
That's such a brilliant book. It's one of like 5 books that I had on my desk while I was writing this book. When I forgot how to put sentences together and like how you move from one idea to the next. How I saw bodies changing over the course of this work. I want to say 2 things. One of them is that although I gave you a sense of some of the embodied experiences of living with pollution, the degrading body is not something that I spend a lot of time on in the book for very, very good reasons, I think. Spectacularizing suffering is not something that the book participates in. That's because I think it doesn't serve people here who are trying to build a different world. And it's because I really care about people here, and I don't want you to spend time with them in hospitals. I want you to spend time with them in their homes. So the book doesn't participate in the work of spectacularizing bodies riddled by pollution over generations. It's more interested in the systems that produce that experience. So systems of violence rather than symptoms of violence. But to just briefly answer the question, bodies change in all sorts of different ways. Some of them are really mundane. Angel talks about like getting to go away to Florida for a vacation and coming back and starting to notice the smell of the neighborhood. There's something about leaving and returning that actually changes her sensory experience of place. Young people talk about, similarly, like learning to, like the practice of growing numb to an environment. So even as some people grow sicker over time, the intensity of one's sensory experience of place is not necessarily more acute. And that's not uncommon in toxic landscapes, and you'll see that in all sorts of ethnographies on a topic like this. And maybe I'll just bracket the other stuff. Thank you, whoever you are. Oh, cute.
I think we have maybe time for one more question.
I think it was Liam, yeah?
Chloe, thank you so much for the talk. It was so wonderful to see it and all the images too. I was interested in the brief mentions of rumor that you had. And thinking, you know, you classified the dusts, I think, as an ambiguous toxic environment. And that made me think of the rumor part too, right? How it could become like a discursive, ambiguous, toxic environment. In the book, you mentioned, you know, rumors about one of these facilities producing. Yeah, I know. Yeah, I read it too, Matt. Yeah, producing Agent Orange, perhaps, but that's something that can't be, you know, qualified, or it can't be confirmed, I should say. Then the rumors of the pop shops selling iPhones for food stamps. You know, but I also imagine rumor actually being maybe a place of opportunity when you're looking at organizers, because, you know, these industrial projects, the renewable energy project is buried under layers of euphemism and obscurity purposefully. I can imagine rumor actually being sort of a location of some opportunity. And so, yeah, how does rumor interface with these speculations of the future? And yeah, what do you think about that?
The most fun I ever had writing for my job, was like it's a category, was writing a piece about rumor in this place. It's a piece that is specifically about these two competing rumors told by the two sides of the incinerator fight, each one speculating that the other was actually controlled by a different actor in the waste industry. So there was a theory that the youth-led campaign was actually controlled by the landfill industry, big landfill, because they stood to benefit from incineration, the incinerator being stopped, right? And a rumor on the campaign side that supporters of the plan were actually controlled by a larger waste-to-energy company that had like much deeper pockets than the one that was operating here. And in the field, like these were like really goofy moments, but with time, I started to see them as really strategic moves to evacuate the claim to local voice of one's opponents in a political field where if you have any power against a proposed toxic imposition, it's local support or local opposition. And it was really interesting to me to start to take that seriously because oftentimes what you see in a lot of the literature on the late industrial experience and places like that, like this, is that doubt is wielded as a weapon, but only by corporations, never by people. People are always the victims of this process. And it was cool to notice that that actually wasn't true, that doubt could be wielded as a weapon against corporations and against one's neighbors that you're fighting with. That's one thing I want to say. The other thing I want to say, and I'm so glad that you picked up on these like little moments in the book, is that one of the things that I actually spend a lot of time on in the book, not so much in this talk, is that this 200-year history of speculative governance is one that has gradually produced uncertainty about the air that wasn't actually always there. So this incapacity to know what is in the air that one is breathing and how it affects your body was produced over 200 years through particular configurations of capital and knowledge practice. And it's produced an experience where even one's embodied knowledge counts as uncertainty, right? And so, so everything is lived in this mode of speculation, right? This mode of conjecture, which is also the genre in which rumor takes root. So even things that you're like pretty sure about because you live them, not just the Agent Orange question, not just who's controlling your opponent, those are reduced to rumor in a lot of spaces of official power making in Baltimore City, and I'm really curious about that and what it takes then to organize in a world where all of your knowledge is classed as uncertainty. Turns out that you have to fight a very different kind of fight than is traditional in environmental justice groups. Yeah, thank you.
Reached the end of our time. I'm sure we could go much longer with all kinds of questions, but please join me in again thanking Chloe for this incredible talk.